Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Yogesh Shavda. I am the host for Next Frontier in Insights. As you know, I'm a lecturer at the University of South Carolina, and I also run my practice called Y2S Consulting, which is focused right now a lot on AI adoption and insights, as well as AI and marketing overall. So today, I am so delighted to have Mike Stevens on. He's running the Insights platform, and I am really excited to have this conversation with him because he's literally on the forefront of what's happening with this whole revolution and insights around AI. So, Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Yogesh. Great to be here. Thank you.
So, before we start talking about all the AI stuff, I know you have a lot to say about it. Um, Give us a brief background about you. What's your background? What got you to where you are today, and what's on your mind right now
Okay.
from your business perspective?
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, look, my Insight platforms. If we work backwards from there, so it's an online B2B media business. We help researchers and insight professionals to find new tools, to learn how to use them, to see what's coming next. So a lot of it is about innovations in technology for research, and that's kind of the intersection that draws a bunch of threads together for me. So I worked for a few years in a couple of B2B research and strategy consultancies. I joined Kantar 20 years ago, which was at the time was a shock to the system. Actually, Research International, as it was at the
Oh
time.
yeah.
Big, esteemed, very
Mhm.
highly respected research agency. Let's say it's gone through a lot of transformation since then.
Yeah.
But very much enjoyed working with the teams and the clients there. I left there, let's say about 15 years ago, and worked for a technology company called Vision Critical. They're now called a leader, and they built private panels, insight communities for media businesses, for retailers, for all sorts of different companies. So I led the European region for a while, and then about 8 years ago, I left to set up my own consulting business. And then what I do now grew out of that, because I don't need to tell you that running your own consulting business is it's a high wire act. You either feast or famine. You're anxious about where your next project's going to come from, or you're drowning in too much work. So that was the focus of that was really on that intersection of technology and research and insights. So helping brands, client teams figure out what they needed to change, what kind of toolkit they should adopt, and then similarly for agencies, but also helping the tech companies with go to market, because when you have companies that come from outside the industry, they don't always have that familiarity with the way the industry works, how to pitch their offer, where to focus, and that kind of thing. So yeah, all across the industry really.
Amazing. So, as you just alluded to, the world has changed dramatically in the last few years. You've been making an amazing attempt to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening. So, give us a sense of how would you describe the current you know insights landscape, and what are you seeing from a technology perspective that's caught your eye?
Yeah, it's constantly a challenge for us to keep on top. There's just so many new tools that are being developed, and I'd say the pace of startup launch has probably increased over the last 18, 24 months, because it's just becoming so much easier for people with a relatively small team
Mhm.
to build around some of the AI foundation models, to bring something to market that is relatively polished. So there's a huge generation of new tools. It's like this kind of Cambrian explosion, and in lots of different sort of categories as well. So on Insight platforms, we have a directory. There's probably too many. We need to rationalize, but there's about 400 categories of tools, and they roll up into about a dozen big buckets. So it's things like, survey software, primary data collection, qualitative. But, within that, obviously, there's so many different flavors. So it's a very, very diverse ecosystem.
Mhm.
And I think that it's easy to apply a kind of simplistic view over the top of it if you're coming at it from the outside, because, as you'll know, different brands, different organizations, their requirements can be quite specific. And it's not just because of a historical legacy or because, this is the way we do things here. There's genuine reasons. If you've got a particular target audience in a particular market, particular product set, you need to do things slightly differently. So I think the industry's grown up on the technology side to reflect some of that, some of that variety. But it's really developing very, very quickly. I think when we look at the opportunity areas for AI, for some of the new capabilities, at a general level, if you read in the Financial Times or The Economist, you'll see knowledge work, aspects of marketing, the law, professional services. Very rarely do they actually say that the number of areas within research and insights where AI is making a big difference is actually is quite astonishing. So you think about the processes that we go through to collect data, to combine it, to synthesize it, to summarize it, to present it. All of those, already we're seeing a huge impact from some of these new AI capabilities.
Amazing. So with that kind of shift that's happening, are you feeling that things are, this sounds like a naive question, but it's, there's a question behind the question, I guess.
Sure.
Are you feeling that, we are actually becoming more innovative with our methodologies and tools, or are we kind of like just accelerating what we've always been doing, which is, better, faster, cheaper, so to speak? More focus on the cheaper, faster than the better, perhaps.
Yes, I think some of the early running around these things inevitably has been, let's drive efficiencies, let's make things faster and and lower cost, and that's actually a longer term trend. It's not just related to AI. If you look at and this is not all, there's not all good outcomes here. If you look at the average trend in the cost per interview since online panels and online surveys came in, that's been trending downwards. The average cost per project. But what it's generated, what it's enabled, is actually far more questions that people have in businesses can be informed by some level of insight, research, knowledge, data. It doesn't always mean that it's done to the highest, standards that we might traditionally have held, but there's data that people can be confident enough to make a decision. So, we've been expanding, I guess, the share of decisions that can be informed by research and insights with falling costs and greater efficiency, since long before this latest wave of AI. Obviously, it's really turbocharged some of that. So I think, we do see a lot of messaging, a lot of value benefits as being it's cheaper and faster to do the same thing. It's a shame because it's eclipsing some of the genuinely new capabilities that are there to do things differently, to add value in new ways. When you think about even something, one of the biggest areas of new startup generation in this space has been in AI moderated interviews. So, we have some companies have been in that space a while, like Inca and and Yasna, companies like that. We've seen a lot more enter that space. And what's actually happening is you're able to generate, in some ways, much better quality data from participants because you can query with them, you can build a bit more of a rapport using a bot. You can actually generate better value for the amount of time that you have with a participant compared to a standard structured survey. You're able to get richer data that you can do more with. So there's lots of those types of aspects that are improving some of the quality as well as the the efficiency and the and the cost effectiveness.
So you mentioned AI generated, interviews, right? Or moderated interviews. Let me just be specific about that. Are there like specific, segments or themes that you're seeing emerge right now? Like, AI moderation is one.
Yeah.
What other themes are you seeing that are pretty, um, broad or common, perhaps, if that's the way to describe it?
Yeah, I think So another, I would say, is about synthesis of an ever greater number of data types.
Mhm.
So, for instance, where you have, what were previously called knowledge management solutions, it's not really the right label for what these things are doing now, but they're effectively integrating many different sources of data in an interface in a way that you can query and say, tell us what our organization knows about Gen Z attitudes to alcohol in this market.
Mhm.
And it will pull back, from all sorts of trend data, from primary research reports, from qual data, ethnography, and it will try and synthesize and serve that up
Mhm.
using an LLM on the front ends that you can you can interact with, but with a with a much more structured way of getting at the data. So there's a few solutions like that. People will know, companies like Stravito, Market Logic, DeepSight, and others. But that's a capability that I think is really going to transform how teams work, because it'll put insights into the hands of users in innovation teams, in communications teams, where they can interact much more naturally with with research and insights data. So I think that's a big area, that kind of synthesis and
Mhm.
joining together. I think one of the other areas that we've got with the general purpose LLMs is synthesizing large volumes of unstructured data. So, can you boil this
Mhm.
200-page PDF down into the key points? That's been incredibly powerful for some aspects of qualitative analysis. So you've got 50 transcripts. Can you pull out some of the key themes? Can you show me how this works? Obviously, these things come with risks and downsides, and there's a debate raging on LinkedIn today between someone who is an academic qualitative researcher, bunged a load of transcripts into ChatGPT, and got back stuff that she wasn't very impressed with, and has concluded that generative AI is rubbish for qualitative research. And it's like, well, okay, there's different there's different ways of fine tuning. There's different products that are built around the core technology that can refine that. But the
Yeah.
synthesis and summary and extracting key insights is a big area. There's a lot of tools being
Mhm.
developed in that space. I mean, the other one, I think, we'd probably talk about where things are going into the future, but synthetic. I mean, people respond, I think, viscerally to the label of synthetic, because they think it's a cheap fiber, rather than synthesized insights from multiple different sources. So
Mhm.
generating artificial personas that you can ask questions of. So rather than having a 200-page segmentation report, you can have a character that you can ask questions of, where so much data has been fed into that to fine tune a model. So those, I think, some of the really interesting, exciting areas, and they overlap. It's hard to say where the boundaries actually fall between these things, because there's so much kind of commonality, but they're being manifested in lots of creative ways, I think.
Amazing. And you brought up synthetic data. You're right. And the example of the unstructured data and the feedback from some person. Um, I'm seeing similar situations happen around that as well, where sometimes I wonder if people actually know what the capabilities of these LLMs actually are, and what toggles is, or what you need to toggle within the LLM
Yeah,
to actually give you the things that you're looking for. I'm not convinced that people know it, but they're very quick to judge it. You
yeah,
know, so
yeah.
I guess my ask of everybody would be to, like, at least ask these LLMs how to think about this before you start judging it, versus just assuming that it's rubbish kind of thing.
Yeah. I would say make sure you're using the latest frontier models. Make sure you're playing at the leading edge and not making
Mhm.
your assumptions based on something you tried 6 months ago, because
Mhm.
the pace of change and the development of these things is quite incredible. When we look at the deep research capabilities in OpenAI, to be able to spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes going and compiling, rationalizing, reasoning through for very niche topics, generating very in-depth reports that are an amazing first step to go and explore a whole new category or a whole new research brief or topic.
Mhm.
It's astonishing, really, how capable these things are. So my plea to people would be, don't base negative assumptions on things that you haven't tried recently.
Exactly. And to that point, I'm going to ask a question. And I'm going to share something that I've been working on too. But are you seeing the emergence of new tools? Like there's been conversations around digital twins is one area, agentic workflows is another one, even simulation tools. What are you seeing in any of those three areas, if anything at all?
Yeah, I think the digital twins thing, I think, is really interesting because the potential for being able to model, small groups or individuals, customers, but then be able to interact them in a privacy compliant way. I think there's ways in which that can help in corporate workflows and being able to stay compliant. So there's definitely growth in that area. I think that the challenge, I think, for a lot of people is a taxonomy of this stuff. So it's like, what's a synthetic respondent? What's a digital twin? What's an artificial persona? We're still kind of feeling our way, and people are not sure quite what language attaches to what. And we see this, people trying to find new definitions all the time. But definitely, I think digital twins, huge potential for being able to, very quickly, test out some hypotheses with data that you can be reasonably confident reflects your your customer base or your particular profiles. I think the agentic workflows is a really compelling area, and I've seen some great demos of being able to condense development timelines that might have taken months previously, to be able to take effectively insights that have been crystallized or synthesized into personas, ask those personas to help generate some ideas, using another agent to then draft 10 ideas based on the output of the consumer agent or the customer agent, and then have other agents that reflect different parts of an innovation workflow. So it could be a designer who's going to create mock-ups, or a compliance person who's going to say we can never bring that to market, or it could be an ingredient specialist that's been modeled to say there's no way we can actually manufacture that because those things are never going to go together. So putting that into a highly automated iterative workflow, I think, has huge potential. Obviously, there's challenges with all of these things. The idea that in theory that can be fully automated end to end. In practice, we're still at the point where there's a trust gap, there's gaps in the data, there's a need for humans who have the expertise to spot things that look weird or wrong, or so the human in the loop and the constant review is an important part of the process. And I think what people are sometimes surprised by is maybe the expectation that it's like, well, we're going to push this button and then out it's going to pop something that is, of comparable standard to the things we've done. And it's like, actually, no, your workflow is going to be about validation and checking and iteration. And, it's not going to save you 100% of your time. It might save you 20%. You're still going to be, interacting and working and checking and making sure that stuff works. But actually what you get out the end may be, much lower cost, much more efficient, much higher volume of ideas, or whatever that, that metric is. So it's, we're all learning, I think, right now.
It's funny you gave that example, because I've actually built an agentic model doing exactly that, right? And I've been testing it with I want to say over 200 people now, just to see different use cases as to what how far can it stretch, from beverages to baby products to you name it. I've tested it now with a lot of people, right? And one VP of marketing last week, in fact, she gave me some feedback saying that, first of all, she was super impressed with what I've built so far, but more importantly, she said that I thought this was going to give me efficiency, like you said, but she said it actually made me think differently about the project I was actually working on. And I would have not thought about this differently had I not gone through this process of using this workflow. And I thought that was a really compelling insight that she shared,
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, we expect that it's going to, it's just going to kind of push button automate a lot of stuff, or it's going to make it massively efficient. But you're right, it stretches thinking, or it points to new ideas, or if it generates 10 ideas and you go, well, that's terrible, but actually we put half of idea 9 with idea 2, and then we've got something, and then you feed it back in. There's a whole lot of different ways of working that are actually, even if your start point might seem to be efficiency, actually ends up being generating things in a fresh way.
Exactly right. So the other, you talked about digital twins, you talked about agentic force. What about simulation tools? Are you seeing any of them at all?
I guess what do you think about sort of whole market simulation, or
market simulation, new product new product launch simulation tool, pricing simulation tool? We use the moment I say pricing, people's head go directly to conjoint, right? But I'm thinking about like literally building like what if scenario planning tools that's based on real data and possibly even synthetic data to help you do certain things.
Do you know, I've seen point solutions for, like you say, for pricing, and there's a couple that I think launched fairly recently. I've not got in too deep with them, but I think the potential here, the more that we're able to pull data of different types in, the more that these things are able to work with more real-time data and be able to adjust on the fly, then I think the simulation potential is huge. But I'm not as close to many of those in terms of actual startups that I've seen.
Okay, interesting. That's interesting for to hear, because I personally think that that's a massive opportunity for the insights industry to embrace this. And in fact, I'm hoping that will actually help channel the debate away from the merits of synthetic data, and the validity of synthetic data, to actually the right use cases for synthetic data, because simulation tools need synthetic data to be able to operate. I've to your point about using, you said earlier about using the latest and greatest tools. Here's an example of Claude Opus 4. You can actually prompt Claude and say, I want to build a simulation tool. Can you help me build one? It just won't give you the code. It'll actually build the tool for you on Claude. It's incredible.
Yeah, I know, it really is. It's just the scope of things. Even with the time that I have, I'm just scraping the surface with the capabilities of what these tools can do. So it's quite. On the one hand, it's inspiring. On the other hand, it kind of gives me a bit of anxiety at the capability of some of these tools.
Yeah, well, but I think this is where, like, when we talk about better, in the better, faster, cheaper, phrase, right? I think this is where the innovation aspect of what we do has to come in, because I think this is an opportunity for vendors. I think it's also an opportunity on the client side of insights professionals, because they need to be able to see these kinds of opportunities, in my opinion. To say, hey, this can actually help me, advance our role internally within an organization, and should demonstrate value,
Yeah, I think so, because whether it's the simulation tools or things like the synthetic personas, these are tools that people can work with as they're developing or making plans, either on their kind of annual brand planning exercises, or when they're launching a product, or when they're at the initial phase. It's tangible things that people can actually work with to help them, make decisions. Whereas I think, the gap between the data, the insight, the research, and the execution has always been a source of frustration. There's been friction there. There's been time delays. There's been formats that people are not able to work with. So I think the more that those tools can connect with the workflows and the tools that that the planners and the innovation teams and all of those other teams are using, the more valuable insight's going to be. Because these teams, they're all hungry for more insight. They all want to be able to, to validate their thinking. I say they all, obviously you've got some people who just want to run with their own idea and find data to prove it. But generally, organizations are really hungry for more consumer insight to help them make more confident decisions. So, I think this kind of more closely tied insights and action, connection will be a big benefit.
I agree 100%. So let's switch gears a little bit. We've talked about the tools and what we're seeing in terms of the landscape.
Yeah.
If you're on the client side, and you're, you know, uh, I think as well as I do. The client side folks are getting bombarded by vendors approaching them and saying,
Yeah.
look at me, kind of thing, right? Um, are you identifying specific kinds of criteria that could be helpful to insights professionals as they're looking at these new tools, or what would be your advice to them?
Yeah, do you know, we actually published an ebook that people can download from the Insight Platform's website quite recently. What did we call it? It was published with Forster, and we called it. Hang on, let me have a quick look. We called it, I think, the smarter way to buy market research software. So there's some tips in there, and it's actually some fairly straightforward stuff, but it's easy to get lost when you're being pitched, when there's shiny things going on. It's really about, you start with your users and your requirements, and go from there. So build out from, really get to grips in a way that you do if you were building a product. Where are you now? What are your bottlenecks? What are your friction points? What are your requirements? And then understand from the users who might be in your team, who might actually be in other teams as well, what exactly they're looking to achieve and where they're likely to go. And then, you do need to build a business case around this stuff to make sure that if you're going to bring in a new tool, what are the criteria? What are the metrics? What are you going to measure performance against?
Mm.
And then it's a point of actually going out, and trying in a more structured way to appraise new vendors. And there's some fairly common things across most types of solutions. It has to be easy to use. There's a reason why, the iPhone and Android, have been the biggest computing platforms in the world, because they focus very heavily on ease of use for people. So, it's not shallow to make sure that's a focus. Integrations, making that, understanding that data is something that you want to connect, you want to join up, you want to cite it in one place to be able to mine it. Those are really important components. So often there are, you want to look for solutions that are more purpose built for insights and research data. Not all the time, but in most cases, they're going to be better at, at the specific use cases you have in this part of the business. So, there's a bunch of things there, I think. But I would say, the ease of use integrations are some of the real big criteria that you want to look at. And then try and have a bit more of a structured approach to evaluating vendors, rather than, being badgered or bumping into people at a conference. Try and have a bit more of a framework to go, okay, we're going to have every 6 months, every 3 months, whatever it is, we're going to see people, we're going to evaluate them against these criteria, and make sure you're being proactive about how you filter new vendors, rather than it being a kind of reactive process.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. What about, one area that I kind of get nervous about a lot, and please tell me if my fears are grounded or ungrounded, whichever way you look at it, is around synthetic data, right? So there are vendors that are offering synthetic data as a solution,
Yeah.
and they, I just feel like, as a client, I would want to know what algorithm you're using in generating synthetic data,
Yeah.
and I don't feel that companies are asking that question, like, what's the source data and what's the algorithm?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, 100%. I think there will be a spectrum of, transparency from vendors. There will be a spectrum of methods and approaches. It's very different to be, augmenting existing data, where you're effectively, it's not the same methods, but we've applied weighting to data sets in research for years. It's not dissimilar in the outcome for that, but it's like, well, how are you actually getting there? There are machine learning approaches now to be able to do that. Or is this, have you just generated, an entire, 1,000-person synthetic data set using a foundation model? There was a great post I was reading the other day by someone who's building a digital twins proposition. He generated 1,000 virtual voters, US election voters, using just the generic ChatGPT model, and was running various questions against them. And then there was voting intent for the 2024 election. 90% voting for Kamala Harris. And it's like, okay, you've got embedded bias in the way that these models are built. You've got a lot of problems. So if you're not really compensating for that, if you're not adjusting, if you're not fine-tuning, so there's a lot of questions, and we are at the early stage of this. I think there's a naivety in adopting a kind of a pro or anti stance around synthetic data. I think I've seen quite a lot of people, less so in the market research community, but a lot in the UX research community, who've said, this is not research, these are not people, we cannot rely on this type of thing. And it's actually been quite hostile. Whereas obviously for some of the vendors, it's like, we're all in. There was a piece last week from Andreessen Horowitz about, everything's just going to be synthetic and agentic, and, market research is dead sort of thing. And it's like, yeah. Okay. So, the kind of the boosterism from the VC community as well isn't terribly helpful. So, but somewhere in the middle, there's okay, let's ask the real questions. What's the data source? How have you derived these things? What have you compensated? How can we test, against our own, benchmarks or data, or how can we understand and build confidence in this data set? How often is it refreshed? So there's a whole load of questions that people need to be asking of these vendors for sure.
So I had a couple of companies reach out to me, and I'm just curious to whether this actually makes sense or not. So one company asked me and said, hey, should we actually do some benchmarking across methodologies, across countries, across different algorithms, so we can better understand when to use it and where to use it.
Yeah.
Right? To which I said, yes, you should do that. Obviously there's an investment involved in doing that, and if the company can afford it, then they should obviously do it.
Yeah.
But do you feel we are at a point where we have to continue doing this kind of stuff, or do you feel that there's enough out there for us to say, what, in these countries using an LLM, generated synthetic data, it's good. In these places, tread with caution. In these places, don't do it at all, or we're not there yet?
It's really hard to say, because the variables in there are going to be, like you say, the country, the language, the category, the specific research objective. I've seen some things that are incredibly close to data that's been collected on a general purpose panel, when it's asking about broad-based consumer products. Are you likely to purchase this ready to drink cocktail within a couple of percentage points of what you'll get. Very easy to model that kind of thing out. But once you start to get into different niche areas, once you start to get into into geographies where there's less data, and once you start to get into things that do change more quickly in terms of market dynamics, then the level of benchmarking is going to vary. So I think it is going to depend on the specifics of each client organization.
But you would, and I totally agree with what you're saying. So, but the question, I think the general point you're making is that you should still be doing benchmarking, so what you're getting yourself into.
Oh, right? yeah, absolutely. Because it's we're still very much in the early stages, and the questions, even if you feel confident, your stakeholders are not necessarily going to feel confident. You're going to have the evidence to say, look, we didn't just make this up out of thin air. We didn't just ask ChatGPT. Here's the process that we went through. Here's the comparisons to to primary research data. We think it works well in this and this scenario. We'd be very cautious about this one. So and then the benchmarks are going to depend. Your level of confidence in the quality of your benchmark data. Again, is another question, because huge challenges in getting really reliable, robust data from certain panels in certain countries, so that also is a factor that are we comparing two imperfect solutions?
Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
I totally understand that. So thanks for that, because I think that it's important for people to understand, why you're paying so much attention to it. I'm paying so much attention to it because, like you said, there's a trust gap that can quickly emerge if you don't do all this foundational work at the end of the day,
Yeah.
right? So I hope those who are listening, are paying heed to what Mike is saying, because just don't jump into it. Do your homework, because it's important. It's absolutely important. So the other question that I don't know how much you're facing it. I'm certainly facing it. Is should you build it in house or should you buy the solution? What are you hearing, and what's your advice on that one?
Yeah. So, obviously it depends on the solution, and it depends on the category as well. So, in highly regulated industries, then, the hurdle for using an external solution is that much higher. There's a lot of work going on to try and build, ring fence solutions. There's some examples of, of companies that have built their own tools already. On the agency side, Ipsos was very quick out the gate building their ipso facto solution in house. And I've seen a lot of people in the kind of pharma healthcare space, trying to do the same, and in finance as well. As a general principle, I've seen good approaches and bad approaches, and this is not specific to AI necessarily. Often, these are things that are driven. The bad approaches can be driven by factors beyond your control as a head of insight. So it could be a corporate decision that's been taken higher up. It could be a very rigid set of IT procurement guidelines. It could be a policy. So I work with a very big consumer goods company who'd been mandated that the only data visualization tool they were going to use anywhere was going to be Power BI. So in order to make all of their research data work effectively with Power BI, they had a team of 4 full-time developers trying to build this thing and make it do things like, significance testing and roll-ups of, multiple response variables that it doesn't do out of the box, which is kind of crazy because there's a dozen different tools that will do that much, much better. So, there's those kind of scenarios. But then I've seen other tools, other examples. In fact, you were part of an event a few weeks ago where we had someone speaking about her experience working for a couple of big consumer goods companies, and they built bespoke, computer vision solutions for putting into small shops in Turkey and across the Middle East for looking at how people are making decisions at point of sale, at fixture. And that's something that needed a combination of bespoke solutions because there wasn't anything available out of the box, but yielded really high quality insights for them. So it's hard to have a hard and fast rule. My instinct is the default should be buy something off the shelf unless there's a really compelling reason not to, I think, rather than start with a 50-50 assumption. And the reason I say that is it's very hard to keep up. If your core business, whether you're an insights team in a corporate or an agency, your core business isn't technology in quite the same way. There are exceptions to this, but generally you're unlikely to be able to move as quickly as as vendors whose business it is specialized. And it can become a bit of a distraction to go and try and build your own thing. The exceptions are, like I say, where you've got a very specific use case and your industry is very specific, or you've got security requirements. If you're an agency, in some cases, you'll have proprietary IP data knowledge that you've got that you're going to want to build into a technology product that you can then go and package and sell on. So that's a slightly different kind of scenario where you will want to build your own technology. And we're actually hosting a panel of agencies who've done just that in an event next week. So it's the nuances are beneath the surface, but my default would probably be go for off the shelf unless there's a compelling reason not to.
Right. Well, back in June, we had I actually launched a product, a custom GPT agent that I built called the Moments Engine,
Right.
Which basically was a labor of love back from 2017, believe it or not.
Right.
When I was working at Spotify, where there was this insight that I had, which was that when you're listening to music, your mood, your moment, your mindset, if whatever you call it, can vary depending on the type of music you're listening to, whether you're being active, whether you're being passive, whether you're listening to it individually or in a social environment, whatever it is, right? So I built out this framework called the 5M framework, and we were testing around with it, at Spotify, and we were seeing some good traction. I forgot about it completely for the longest time, right? I'd done all this work back in 2017. Fast forward to an article I saw from IBM where they were talking about what CMOs are thinking about from an AI perspective, and one of the things that they talk about in that article is the fact that the marketing funnel is kind of like being redefined around moments. And it triggered back to me to what I was doing on 2017. So I actually went and rebuilt that whole thing as a custom GPT agent now, and oh my gosh, it's giving incredible output. So I would love to show it to you sometime. When you've got some time. But for me, to your point about build or buy, I think on the client side, companies obviously are thinking about it in the context of their business and their category, but there are people out there who are innovating, like you and me, who are coming up with new ways to think about old problems that could solve it in a different way. So I just think the buy approach is probably going to become the more prevalent issue way of doing things. But the whole security thing is the problem, I think, that we have to overcome.
Yeah. I think I guess I'm answering that with a corporate insights data function, in mind as the persona. But I'm just thinking as you're talking, the build and buy thing is actually, it's not quite a hard line between them anymore, because there's a kind of, assemble from different components with no code, low code tools like E13 and Zapier that allow you to kind of, to build your own things. Now, that's very difficult in a corporate environment, data security, everything locked down. But if you are a small business, a startup, a micro freelancer, whatever, actually the power to be able to do that is phenomenal. To be able to tie things together, to build your own agents, to create, the tools that nobody else has that amplify your value and expand, is a really powerful thing. So, I think that the answer is very, very different depending on where you sit and what, what constraints you've got around you.
Yeah. So how do people avoid the shiny object syndrome? Because that's, I could claim and say, I built a shiny object here, right? Look at me. But, there are a lot of distractions at this point in time, right? So any guidance for people as to how to manage that or avoid that?
Yeah, the thing that sticks in mind with me is a couple of years ago. Are we a couple of years ago now? Yeah, must be. Sam Altman, after ChatGPT had launched for a little while, one of the things I heard him say on a podcast was, the thing about it is the more you use it, the less impressive it seems, and it's and I think what he's saying is, when you use these tools, you realize where the limitations are. You understand about things like hallucinations. You understand, that it's good for this and not so good for that. And I think broadly, if we just step back, when you think about the shiny object syndrome, what that can come from is not, is being wowed by something that you've seen for the first time, or, it seems very impressive on first demo. I think the way that you inoculate yourself against that is with as much knowledge as you can get. I know it's hard, people have limited bandwidth, but, I would always say, get a structured approach to staying informed. And that might be a member of your team who is the champion, who's, you're going to say, we're going to dedicate, 4 hours a week of this person to, to check out new things, to see demos, to stay on top, to communicate to the rest of the team, and try and stay as on top of as many of these areas as you can, because it's changing so fast. It is very easy to be kind of bowled over by new stuff if you haven't, if it's the very first time that you're discovering it. So, I know you're a big advocate of this, but as an individual, spend time playing with all these different tools, with music generators, with video generators, with with all the different avatars. Get an understanding of the foundation capabilities, and then you're less likely to be bowled over by somebody demoing a new research tech tool, you're less likely to feel like, wow, this is incredible, because you'll be a bit more familiar and confident in the capabilities. So I think staying informed is going to be the greatest way to minimize the risk of shiny object syndrome, for sure.
I love that answer, because you're right. Because once you start understanding, the pros and cons and the limits and stuff like that, it's easier for you to assess what's coming at you, right? So
Yeah.
makes complete sense. Tell me one thing. I know you had me on, for your webinar series around new skill sets,
Yeah.
but there was one lingering question in my mind, which was, I wanted to ask you the same question too, yeah, given the fact that you're seeing things in terms of skill set adoption right now and AI adoption in general. What are you seeing, and what would be your counsel to people as they're trying to work their way up the adoption curve, so to speak?
Yeah, in terms of what the skills that
Yeah.
that people require.
Yeah.
I would say this is a bit of a moving target for me, because I'm constantly trying to feel my way as to where's the opportunity that's going to be valuable, for the longest period of time for people. I think there's probably a few buckets here. So one is AI tool adoption is just going to proliferate enormously,
Mhm.
but organizations are going to need people who are good at mapping the requirements for AI tools, for implementing them, for testing them, to working with them. So, there is something around these things are not just going to deploy themselves and wipe out, workloads and jobs overnight. There's going to be a lot of work to do that. So I would say one area is very much learn how to specify, adopt, work with AI tools, because they're going to be, the way that things go forward. I think, a little bit what we just talked about, but there's also going to be things, and this again changes month to month. It's like, well, what do the AI tools not do very well? Are there gaps? Are there things? And in the medium term, it's before they're connected to robotics with good world models. It is going to be stuff in the physical world and things like that. But I think there are things in organizations, in knowledge work, that require context, that require reasoning, that require kind of long dated scenario planning, and things that bring to those are things that models are still struggling with, even though they're becoming more and more capable. So there's a whole load of stuff there, which is what's the human thing. And then I think there are some, we talked about it earlier, what are the human in the loop things that are going to need to be there for quite some time around validation, verification. Are we sure that we can really trust? The models are amazing, but one of the things that we conflate is the kind of traditional computing, if this, deterministic, if this then that, assumption around computers. That's not what these things are. The probabilistic nature of them means they're going to be very convincingly wrong about some things, and it's going to be hard to spot what the wrong stuff is.
Yeah.
That's not a reason not to use them. It's a reason to keep people in the loop, to verify and validate and make sure that it's on track, because they do other amazing things, that are not just about kind of factual accuracy. So it's, there's a bunch of things around that. I mean, I think if we bring it down specifically for insight teams, I'd probably make some changes to this. A couple of months ago, I gave a presentation on sort of roles and opportunities for people with research skills in the AI era. I think there's some stuff around how are you that kind of creative strategist person? So on top of AI models that are pulling data and insights together and sort of generating ideas, how do you become the link with an organization to translate, to help turn that into meaningful innovation ideas or meaningful, creative ideas? There's a strong need for insights people there. I think there will be a need for people who can identify where's the real nuggets of useful data, because we're going to be generating so much more data. That's the risk in all of this. There's this kind of like, just feeling swamped with all these reports and all this data that's going to come. It's going to be quite easy for people to cherry pick the answers that they want, because they can kind of generate them. So you need people who are honest brokers, who can really tell the story and and build a narrative. And then I think there's people who can manage data flows. So able to kind of think strategically about, we're going to be bringing data in all these different formats. We're no longer thinking about projects that agencies do. We're thinking about continuous streams of data that come in different formats from different sources, but need to be combined. How do we conceptualize, manage that? What are the ethics? What are the privacy requirements? How do we put those together in a structured, technology sense? That's a huge area of skills that I think is going to be in demand.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. So, I love that answer because, you're touching on like tool fluency. You're talking about, understanding, the role of, the human versus the AI and how the two interact. I think those are really critical skill sets that people need to think about in terms of how they want to go about,
Yeah.
uh, upskilling themselves, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Tell me, we're almost at the top of the hour, so I want to just kind of um, ask you a couple more questions. One of the questions I had for you is that it's hard to predict what's going to come next, right? It's extremely hard in this environment that we're in. But if there's one thing that excites you, what would that one thing be right now?
Um, so I think it's the potential for, and this is going to sound a bit abstract to start with, but it's the potential to generate entirely new structures for for creating value here. So whether that's on the agency side or in insights teams. Now, if you think about a small insights team in a mid-sized corporate, 1, 2, 5 people,
Mhm.
historically there's been a lot of traffic management, stakeholder management, agency supply management. I think increasingly there's going to be the ability to have agent-based systems, data synthesized from multiple sources that then empowers those people to be able to do much more valuable stuff. So to be able to put things in the hands of stakeholders that they can interact with directly, to be able to advise and and lead in the business. And I think the flip side is the agency model. When you think historically, it's been a bit of a it's been a pyramid structure. You've had senior people, you've had middle management, you've had a lot of junior people doing stuff.
Mhm.
And this is this comes with its own downsides as well. But I think there's a potential for the pyramid to be inverted in some ways, where you've got senior experienced people who understand how to work with the AI models and the tools. So you've got these agents, you've got these ability to combine data, and then again to be adding more value rather than a client who never sees the senior person that sold them the project. They're going to be working with those people much more who are going to be building on top of AI. So I think that really encompasses the sort of the agentic stuff, the being able to synthesize data into one place, some of the sort of synthetic models. For me, it's more about what does it enable rather than what does each individual bit of functionality, look like.
Mhm. Amazing, amazing. Well, there's a lot there that we could continue to unpack, but I think it remains to be seen how quickly this will happen because some people might say it might take 2 or 3 years. It might actually happen in 2 or 3 months. You just don't know.
Yeah, I think it depends on the amount of institutional drag that you've got. I mean, it's not always a function of size, but it can be. I think what we're seeing is new models of agencies and teams starting to pop up now, and in organizations that can adapt a lot more quickly. So yeah, will be interesting to see how that changes.
Absolutely. So I want to end by asking you, one question. As you think about the Insights platform, your business, right? What's next?
For our business, well, we're doing probably too many things. We're a really small team. There's only 4 of us, and we just launched a podcast, which is with people who are not based in the big established markets like the US and the UK. It's interviewing people in Africa, leading insights functions in Asia, so talking about their experiences. So that's the thing. We've got a big global audience. We want to make sure we're speaking to them. We are actually just about to launch a bunch of educational guides for corporate research teams. So neutral educational content about different capabilities. So the Corporate Researcher's Guide to Insight Communities and Panels is about to launch. We'll do one on AI, we'll do one on qualitative research. So we're going to be publishing more content. And I think in what we want to do is help people make connections a little bit better. We host a lot of virtual events. We have a directory, we have lots of ways of bringing people together. But I think what we'll want to do is find opportunities that people can meet virtually online, build a bit more community around that, so that people can actually start to have conversations and do the kind of discovery that I was talking about, so that it's people are learning about new tools and methods all the time. So yeah, there's lots in the pipeline.
Amazing. Well, listen, I've been very fortunate that I'm part of your directory now, and thank you for that. And having participated in the webinar, I thought was absolutely incredible. You actually inspired me so much in the process as well. So, thank you so much for that. And Mike, this has been an incredible conversation. And you've kind of enlightened us in a lot of different spaces in terms of not only what's happening, but also in terms of how to think about technology adoption in the insight space. So really, really, grateful for you being on here. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Yogesh. It's always a pleasure to catch up.
Fantastic. So, for those who are listening, July 25th, I think, is the next time we're going to be on with Amanda Jeffs. She's leading an organization called She Is AI. And she's based out in New Zealand. It's going to be an incredible conversation with her as well. So hopefully you can join us then. And thank you, everybody, for joining today.
Thanks.